"I was not supposed to tell you this yet," Harvey Atkins said, and then the words poured out of him like the river at their feet, like something that had been dammed up for so long that no force on earth could hold it back any longer. Annie Dugan stood at the edge of the Cimarron River with her boots sinking slightly into the soft red mud, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold and amber behind her, and she felt the ground shift beneath her, even though the earth itself had not moved. The water moved fast beside them, swollen from last week's rain, and the sound of it was almost loud enough to swallow Harvey's words whole. Almost, but not quite. "You work for Calhoun," she said. Her voice did not break. She would not let it break. "You have been working for Calhoun this entire time." Harvey did not deny it. That was the worst part. He stood there with his hat in his hands, his dark eyes finding hers and refusing to look away, and he did not deny a single word of it. "Annie," he started. "Do not say my name like that," she said. "Not right now." The betrayal that moved through her chest felt like a branding iron. She had trusted this man. She had let him ride beside her across 3 counties. She had told him things she had never told another living soul, secrets about the deed to her father's land, about the hidden well, about the route she intended to take when she moved the cattle northward in the spring. She had told him all of it, and now she understood with a cold, horrible clarity why he had been so patient, so kind, so perfectly placed at every turn. She turned away from him and stared at the river, because if she kept looking at his face, she was going to do something she could not take back, and she had enough things in her life that could not be taken back already. This was not where the story began. It had started 6 weeks earlier in the small, sun-bleached town of Rock, Oklahoma Territory, in the summer of 1889, just months after the famous land run had turned the territory into a churning, desperate scramble of claims and counterclaims, and men who were willing to do terrible things to secure a future on this raw, red land. Annie Dugan had come to Rock the way most people came to Rock, which was to say she had arrived with more determination than money and more stubbornness than sense, or so her Aunt Cora had always told her. She was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and green eyes that people tended to underestimate until those people had found themselves on the losing end of a negotiation with her. She had inherited her father's cattle operation 6 months ago, following his death from a fever that had taken him fast and without warning, and she had discovered in the process of inheriting it that her father had left behind a great number of problems along with the land. The land itself was extraordinary, 240 acres along the western bank of the Cimarron, with access to water that most ranchers in the territory would have traded their souls to secure. Her father, Thomas Dugan, had claimed it in the land run itself, had ridden in with the rush of thousands and driven his stake into the ground and come back to Missouri to sell everything and bring his family west. But Thomas Dugan had not survived to see what his land would become, and now his daughter stood in his place. The biggest problem, and it was a very large problem indeed, was a man named Gerald Calhoun. Calhoun was what the territory had instead of a king. He owned the bank in Rock. He owned the feed store. He owned 3 of the 4 saloons. He had men who carried guns and ran errands that were never written down anywhere. He had arrived in the territory before the land run, had done business with the federal surveyors, and there were whispers, never quite spoken above a whisper, that some of his land claims were built on arrangements that would not survive careful scrutiny. He wanted the Dugan land. He had made his interest known to Annie in a meeting at the Rock Bank 3 weeks after she had arrived in the territory to take possession of her inheritance. He had been polite about it in the way that men who hold all the visible power tend to be polite, which is to say, with a gentleness that contains the clear implication of what will happen if the gentleness is refused. He had offered her a fair price, he said. More than fair. He had told her that a young woman alone in the territory had no business trying to run a cattle operation of that size without the proper support structures in place. He had smiled when he said it, and his smile had made the hair on the back of Annie's neck stand up. She had told him she would think about it. She had no intention of thinking about it. What she had been thinking about in the days following that meeting was how to get enough cattle together to make a northward drive that spring, to sell at a profit large enough to make herself financially independent of anything Calhoun might try to do to pressure her. She had also been thinking about the mortgage on the land, which her father had arranged with Calhoun's own bank and which was due to be renegotiated in the autumn. She needed money. She needed hands she could trust. She needed someone who knew this territory, its water sources, its hidden routes, its dangers, in ways she did not yet know it herself. She had been in the Redrock Mercantile buying provisions when the man had walked in. She had noticed him the way you notice whether moving in, something about the particular quality of his presence that registered before she had consciously decided to look at him. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked outside and ate irregularly, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair showing beneath a battered brown hat. He carried himself with the particular economy of movement she associated with men who had been in difficult situations, often enough that they had stopped wasting motion. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, well-maintained, and his boots were good quality but worked hard. He had asked about work at the counter while Annie was pretending to examine bolts of cloth she had no intention of buying. He had a quiet voice, level and careful, and he had told the mercantile owner that he was new to the territory, knew cattle and horses and trail work, and was looking for a place to put down roots. Annie had turned around before she could stop herself. "I might have use for a hand," she had said. He had looked at her with those dark eyes, and something in his expression had shifted in a way she could not immediately categorize, and then he had extended his hand and said, "Harvey Atkins, ma'am." That had been the beginning. She had taken him on provisionally, which was how she did most things, with a clear set of terms and the understanding that the arrangement would be evaluated on its merits. Harvey had turned out to have merits worth evaluating. He knew cattle the way some men know horses, with an intuitive reading of their moods and needs that went beyond technique into something closer to instinct. He could fix fencing and red land and shoe a horse, and he could cook over an open fire well enough that the 3 other hands Annie had managed to hire stopped complaining about the food after the first week. He had also turned out to be, against every wall Annie had built against such things since the death of her father and the subsequent collapse of the future she had thought she was going to have, interesting to talk to. She had not expected that. She had not expected the way he listened, with a quality of attention that felt almost old-fashioned, as if she were saying things worth remembering. She had not expected the quiet humor that appeared occasionally at the edges of his words, dry and unexpected, like water found in a place you had not thought to look. She had not expected the way he had opinions about things that mattered, about the rights of the Cheyenne and Arapaho who had been pushed off this land, that was now being scrambled over by white settlers, about the way the railroad companies were reshaping the territory in ways that would benefit some people enormously, and others not at all, about the particular cruelty of a system that allowed a man like Calhoun to accumulate the kind of leverage he had accumulated. She had not expected any of it, and because she had not expected it, she had not had her defenses properly arranged when it started to matter. It had started to matter around the end of the second week, when they had ridden out together to check the condition of the northern fence line, and had found themselves 6 miles from the homestead as the sun went down, and Harvey had built a fire and made coffee, and they had sat on opposite sides of the fire for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable. And then he had said, carefully, as if he had been thinking about it for some time, "Your father must have been a remarkable man." Annie had looked up from her coffee. "Why do you say that?" She asked. "Because of what he chose," Harvey said. "Not just the land. Any man with enough nerve and a fast horse could have staked a claim, but what he built on it, the way it's set up, the layout of the pastures and the access to the river. He was thinking long-term. He was thinking about what this land could be." Annie had been quiet for a moment. No one had talked to her about her father like this, as a man whose choices and vision were worth analyzing and admiring. Most people had talked to her about her father as a problem, something left behind that she needed to deal with. She had said finally, he was remarkable. And something had opened up in the conversation after that, a kind of permission that had not existed before, and they had talked until the fire was low about Thomas Dugan and what he had believed and what he had built. And Harvey had listened with that attention of his, asking questions that showed he understood what she was telling him. And when they had ridden back to the homestead under a sky full of more stars than Annie had ever seen in Missouri, she had felt something she had not felt in months. She had felt less alone. That was the thing that made the betrayal so much worse, because the feeling of being less alone was the thing she had been most careful about. It was the most vulnerable spot in the whole fortress she had built around herself since Thomas Dugan's death and the subsequent shattering of a life she had been building in St. Louis with a man named Edward Marsh, who had been her intended, and who had, upon hearing about the complexity of her inheritance and the debts attached to it, discovered that his feelings for her were perhaps not as permanent as he had previously represented. She had come west already carrying that particular wound, and she had added it to the longer list of griefs she carried, the way you add a stone to a saddlebag, feeling the weight increase but keeping moving anyway because stopping is not an option. She had not meant to let Harvey Atkins get close enough to see any of that, but he had gotten close, quietly and without apparent effort, the way water gets into rock, not through force but through persistence and the finding of every available crack. By the end of the third week, she had been looking forward to the evenings, to the hour after the other hands had turned in when she and Harvey would sit on the porch of the small ranch house and drink coffee and talk. She had told herself it was practical, that they were discussing the operation, planning the cattle drive, evaluating the land. And some of it was that. But some of it was just the two of them finding out who the other one was. And that process had become something she was not willing to examine too closely, because she suspected that if she examined it, she would have to make a decision about it. And she was not ready to make that decision. Harvey had his own stories, though he shared them more carefully than she shared hers, parceling them out in small pieces rather than the longer flows she found herself moving into on the evenings when she forgot to be careful. He had grown up in Texas, he said, south of San Antonio, the son of a cattle hand who had worked various ranches and never quite settled. He had worked cattle drives up the Kishom Trail twice in his younger years, had spent time in Kansas, had done various work across the territory that he described in terms general enough that she noticed their generality without quite being able to put her finger on what was missing. She should have noticed that. She noticed it later, when it was too late to matter. What she noticed at the time was that when he talked about things that moved him, the land, the cattle, the peculiar democracy of a long drive where men from every background and situation were reduced to the same basic requirements of survival and work, his voice changed in a way that she had come to find almost physically compelling. There was something in the plainness of his feeling when he let it show, the way he did not dress it up or manage it, that made her trust him more than she should have. She had thought about kissing him for the first time at the end of the third week, and had been so startled by the thought that she had stood up abruptly from the porch and excused herself with an excuse so thin that she had seen the slight curve of something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close, and that had made everything worse. The fourth week had brought trouble that clarified certain priorities. One of Calhoun's men, a broad-shouldered individual named Tate, who seemed to function as Calhoun's primary communicator of messages that could not be committed to paper, had ridden out to the Dugan property on a Tuesday morning and delivered a second offer for the land. The offer was larger than the first one and framed with a new quality of urgency that Annie had found illuminating. Calhoun wanted this land badly enough to increase his bid significantly in a short period of time, and that told her something important about the land's value that she had perhaps not fully appreciated. She had refused the offer. Tate had looked at her for a long moment before he left, with the kind of look that is not quite a threat only because nothing has been said out loud, and then he had ridden away. Harvey, who had been working on the south fence and had seen Tate arrive and leave, had come to find her afterward. He had found her in the barn where she had gone because she needed a moment that was not visible to anyone, and she had been standing with her forehead against the neck of her horse, a gray mare named Dusty who was the most reliable relationship in her current life, and she had not heard Harvey come in. "He'll send someone else next time," Harvey had said quietly from the doorway. Annie had lifted her head and turned around. "I know that. Might be someone less polite. I know that too." Harvey had been quiet for a moment, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he had said, "You don't have to do this alone, Annie." It was the first time he had used her first name without the honorific, and the shift in it had been so small and so significant at the same time that she had not known what to do with it for a moment. "I've been doing things alone for a while now," she had said, which was both true and a deflection, and she suspected he knew it was both. "That doesn't mean you have to keep doing it that way," he had said. She had looked at him standing in the doorway of her father's barn on her father's land, and she had felt something move in her chest that was both terrifying and, underneath the terror, something she recognized as hope, which was almost more frightening. She had said, "I'll think about it," which was what she said when she had already made a decision but was not ready to admit it yet. They had ridden out together the next day to check the western pasture, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the quality of the grass along the river bank, Harvey had reached across from his horse and tucked a loose strand of her hair back under the brim of her hat, a gesture so casual and so careful at the same time that she had sat very still for a moment as if sudden movement might break something. "Thank you," she had said. "Of course," he had said. And they had ridden on, and neither of them had said anything about it, but something had shifted permanently in the space between them. A threshold crossed so quietly that neither of them had needed to announce it. That was when the feelings she had been trying not to have had become impossible to ignore. She had started to notice the particular sound of his footstep crossing the yard in the morning, distinct from the footsteps of the other hands. She had started to find reasons to ask his opinion on things she was perfectly capable of deciding herself, not because she needed the input, but because she wanted to hear what he thought. She had caught herself, more than once, watching his hands when he worked, the way they moved with that economy and sureness that characterized everything he did, and she had had to redirect her attention firmly elsewhere. She had told herself this was impractical. She had told herself she could not afford distraction while Calhoun was circling her land like a hawk circling prey. She had told herself that she barely knew this man, that his past was a series of careful gaps, that the reasonable and sensible thing was to maintain the professional boundary she had established at the start of their arrangement. She had told herself all of this with great conviction, and it had not helped in the slightest. What had finally broken through her careful self-management had been an evening in the 5th week. A thunderstorm rolling in from the west the way Oklahoma Territory storms do, fast and enormous, and without much warning. They had been checking the eastern fence line together when the sky had gone from gold to green, to the particular bruised purple that meant serious weather, and they had ridden hard for the shelter of the cottonwood grove near the river bend, reaching it just ahead of the rain. They had dismounted and stood beneath the trees with the horses, the rain coming in sideways and the thunder loud enough to feel in the chest, and they had been pressed close together by the narrowness of the dry space beneath the biggest cottonwood, close enough that Annie could feel the warmth coming off him and smell the particular combination of sweat and leather, and something else that she had already, without consciously cataloging it, come to associate entirely with Harvey Atkins. He had been watching the lightning over the river, his shoulder against hers, and he had said very quietly, as if the storm had created a permission for quietness that the open air did not have. "I have not felt settled anywhere in a long time." She had looked up at him. "What does settled feel like?" He had looked down at her then, and they had been very close, close enough that she could see the specific dark brown warmth of his eyes and the slight roughness of the jaw. He had not shaved that morning, and he had said, "Like this. Right now, I think." She had kissed him. She had not planned it. It had happened the way certain things happen in storms, the lightning, the necessity, the afterwards, and it had been a brief thing, barely a moment, and then she had pulled back and they had both been very still and the rain had been very loud around them. "Annie," he had said. "Don't apologize," she had said quickly. "I wasn't going to," he had said, and something in the steadiness of it had made her feel simultaneously braver and more frightened than she had felt in years. They had ridden back to the homestead in the clearing rain without speaking, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It had that warm, particular quality of something understood without needing to be said yet. That evening on the porch, he had sat close enough that their arms touched and they had talked about small things: the cattle count, the upcoming drive, the state of the north pasture, and underneath all the practical conversation there had been this new current running, warm and present, and Annie had gone to bed that night with her heart doing something unfamiliar that she had finally allowed herself to identify as happiness. That had been 4 days ago. And then this morning she had ridden into Redrock to collect the mail and a supply order, and she had been at the post office when she had overheard 2 men talking in the street outside the open window, 2 of Calhoun's men, the broad one named Tate, and a wiry younger one she did not know the name of, and they had been talking without care because they had not known she was there. "Atkins still has her trust," the wiry one had said. "Far as we know," Tate had said. "Calhoun wants the information about the mortgage paperwork and the deed before the end of the month. Atkins was supposed to have it by now. What's taking him so long? Don't know. Calhoun's getting impatient. Starting to wonder if Atkins is getting soft." Annie had stood very still with the mail in her hands and felt the floor of her world drop away. She had walked out of the post office without collecting her supply order. She had ridden back to the ranch in a state of such controlled fury that she had not been able to feel her hands properly for the first 20 minutes of the ride. By the time she had arrived, the fury had settled into something colder and more purposeful, and she had looked across the yard to where Harvey was working on a section of broken corral fence, and she had said, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Come with me. I need to talk to you." She had walked to the river without looking back to see if he was following because she had known he would follow, and she had stood at the edge of the Cimarron with the red mud under her boots and the current moving fast beside her and waited for him to catch up. She had not asked him to explain. She had not given him the chance to deny it. She had said, "Tate, Calhoun, the deed. What are you supposed to find out for him?" She had watched his face as she said it, and she had seen with devastating clarity the confirmation she did not want, the brief flash of something behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, but the recognition that the hidden thing was now exposed, the particular expression of a secret scene. And then he had said those words, "I was not supposed to tell you this yet." And then he had told her anyway there by the river. He had worked for Calhoun. That much was true. He had come to Redrock 6 weeks ago with a specific assignment from Calhoun, who had been tracking the Dugan property situation since Thomas Dugan's death, and had seen the arrival of Thomas's daughter as a development requiring management. The plan had been for Harvey to get hired on as a hand, earn her trust, learn the details of her situation, particularly the state of the mortgage and the deed and any legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and report back. In exchange, Calhoun had offered Harvey a sum of money that had been significant enough to be interesting to a man who had been drifting and broke for the better part of 2 years. He had taken the job. He had come to Redrock. He had walked into the mercantile where he had known she would be, because Calhoun's man had told him her schedule. All of this was true, and Harvey did not try to make it less true than it was. He stood by the river with his hat in his hands and told it plainly. And Annie listened with her arms wrapped around herself and her jaw set in the hard line that was the face she made when she would not let herself cry in front of another person. But here was the other part, the part that he said had not been planned, the part she did not know what to do with. He had come with a plan and a hidden motive and every intention of carrying out the assignment cleanly and without complication, and then something had gone wrong with the plan in a way he had not anticipated. "I started to know you," he said simply, standing there by the river in the afternoon gold. "And then I kept knowing you, and somewhere in there I stopped being able to do what I came here to do." "How long?" Annie asked, her voice barely above the sound of the water. "How long ago did you stop being able to do it?" He was quiet for a moment. "The night we sat by the fire and you told me about your father." "I went back to town that week to give Calhoun's man an update and I did not tell him anything useful. I told him you were still considering the offer. I told him the operation was in worse shape than it was. I told him what I thought would buy time." "Why?" The word came out raw and unguarded and she hated how much was in it. Harvey looked at her with those dark eyes, and there was no performance in what she saw there, no management of the impression he was creating. There was just a man who had done a dishonest thing and was now standing in the full consequence of it with his hands visible. "Because I could not let him use me to hurt you," he said. "I know that doesn't fix what I did. I know I came here with a dark purpose and that the foundation of everything between us has a lie underneath it. I know that. But I am telling you now because I cannot carry it anymore and because whatever happens after this, you deserve to know the truth." Annie turned to look at the river. The Cimarron moved past them, red-brown and fast, carrying water from somewhere else toward somewhere she could not see. She had an urge to step into it, to be carried by it, to let the current make the decision about direction for a while. She did not step into it. She stood where she was, which was what she always did. "Calhoun is going to come for the land by another means when he realizes you are not going to give him what he wants," she said. "Yes. The mortgage renegotiation is in September. That is 6 weeks away. Yes. If he refuses to renegotiate or calls in the full amount, I cannot pay it. Not yet. The cattle drive north would need to go in the next 3 weeks to generate the capital in time." Harvey was quiet for a moment. "There is something else," he said. She looked at him. "When Calhoun hired me, he told me certain things, about the land, about your father's original deed." He hesitated. "Annie, your father's land claim is solid. I want you to know that first. But Calhoun has been working with a federal surveyor named Rowlands to have the boundary markers of your western pasture quietly moved. If it goes through the way he has arranged it, you lose the access to the river. Without the river, the land's value drops to almost nothing, and the cattle operation is not viable." Annie felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather move through her. "When is this supposed to happen?" "Rowlands is due back in the territory in 2 weeks. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing he had come to extract from her, the vulnerabilities, the timelines, the pressure points. Instead, he was handing her all of it, laying out the trap so she could see the shape of it clearly, giving her the one thing that might let her escape it. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "I already told you why. I want you to say it plainly." Harvey held her gaze, and she saw the difficulty in him, not the difficulty of deciding whether to say it. She thought he had already decided that, but the difficulty of being fully seen in the moment of saying it, the nakedness of it. "Because I am in love with you," he said. "And I know I have no right to say that, given what I came here to do. I know it may mean nothing to you, given the circumstances. I know you may want me off your property before sundown, and I will not argue with that if that is what you decide. But you asked me to say it plainly, and that is the plain truth of it." The river moved between them and the distant world, carrying its water toward wherever water goes. Annie uncrossed her arms. She turned toward the river and then back toward him, and she felt the full weight of the moment, the betrayal that was real and the truth that was also real and the particular cruelty of a situation in which both things were true at the same time. "I need you to leave me alone for a while," she said. Harvey nodded. He put his hat back on his head with both hands, a gesture so familiar to her already that it hurt to notice it, and he turned and walked back toward the homestead. Annie stood by the river for a long time after he left. She stood there while the sun moved lower in the sky, and the shadows of the cottonwoods lengthened across the water, and the evening insects began their evening noise. She stood there and thought about her father and the land and the mortgage and the surveyor named Rowlands, and the man named Calhoun who had decided her life was a problem he could solve with money and leverage. She thought about the way Harvey had sat across the fire from her and listened as if what she said was worth listening to. She thought about the specific feeling of his shoulder against hers in the storm, the warmth of it, the way it had felt like something she had not realized she was hungry for until it was right there. She thought about the kiss in the thunderstorm. She thought about betrayal and about truth, and about the fact that both could exist in the same person at the same time, and whether that was a thing that could be navigated or whether it was simply a wreckage that had to be walked away from. She thought about the fact that he had not had to tell her any of it. He could have continued to give Calhoun useless information. He could have let the situation play out and she would never have known his original purpose. He could have protected himself from this exact moment of exposure, and he had chosen not to. She picked up a flat stone from the riverbank and threw it sideways across the water and watched it skip once, twice, 3 times before it was taken by the current. Her father had taught her to skip stones when she was 7 years old. She walked back to the homestead. Harvey was in the barn, which was where he had been the night Tate had come, and she had pressed her forehead against Dusty's neck, which struck her now as significant in some way she could not entirely articulate. She stood in the barn doorway, which was where he had stood that night. "If I ask you to stay," she said carefully, "I'm not saying that what you did was acceptable. I'm not saying that trust is fully restored. I am saying that what you know about Calhoun's plans is information I need. And I am saying that what I felt before this afternoon was real, and I am not certain that it stops being real just because the foundation it was built on had a crack in it." Harvey turned from where he had been standing with his hand on Dusty's neck, which was a detail she noticed and which somehow made something in her chest ache. "I understand all 3 of those things," he said quietly. "I am going to need you to earn the trust back," she said. "That is not a small thing and it is not a fast thing. I know. And I need everything you know about Calhoun's operation. Every name, every arrangement, every pressure point. If we are going to protect this land, I need every piece of it." "You'll have all of it," he said. "Whatever I know is yours." She nodded once, the crisp nod she used when a decision had been made and filed. Then she said, because she wanted to say it and because she was tired of not saying the things she wanted to say, "I am also not pretending that I do not have feelings for you, but we are doing this in order, Harvey. Land first, then everything else." The corner of his mouth moved barely, just that small not quite smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Do not yes, ma'am me," she said, but she was already walking back toward the house, and she did not want him to see that there was something perilously close to a smile at the corner of her own mouth. That night, they sat at the kitchen table and Harvey told her everything he knew. He went through it systematically, in the careful way he approached most things, starting with Calhoun's arrangement with the surveyor Rowlands, and working out from there to the larger network of arrangements, the men on the payroll, the legal mechanisms Calhoun used, the specific people in the territorial government who owed him favors. Annie listened and made notes in the small journal she kept for the ranch's operational details, her handwriting small and precise, recording everything Harvey said in a format she could use. By the time they were finished, close to midnight, she had a picture of Calhoun's operation that was considerably more complete than she had possessed 12 hours earlier, and with it, the shape of a possible response. "The surveyor is the key," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "If Rowlands has already falsified or is planning to falsify the boundary survey, that is a federal offense. The territory is administered under federal authority. If I can get the evidence of what Rowlands and Calhoun have arranged to the federal marshal's office in Guthrie before Rowlands arrives here to move the markers, that changes everything. You would need documentation, Harvey said. My word against Calhoun's doesn't carry much weight in this territory. What exists? What was written down? Harvey thought for a moment. Calhoun keeps records. He is meticulous about them because he thinks they protect him. There is a set of ledgers in his office at the bank. There are letters between him and Rowlands. When he hired me, there was a written agreement. I have my copy. Your copy of the agreement that details the arrangement for you to get information about my land. Yes, Harvey said, and he did not look away. Which documents his own conspiracy and which I will give to the federal marshal along with everything else I know. Annie looked at him. That document implicates you as well. I know. You could go to prison. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I went into this with a dark purpose, Annie. I am not going to try to walk out of the consequences of that. If the marshal needs my testimony and that testimony puts me in front of a judge, I will deal with that. She was quiet for a moment. I am not interested in seeing you go to prison, she said, which was the closest she could come at that moment to saying what she actually felt. I know you're not, he said, but it's not your decision to make. It's mine. She had a sudden fierce feeling for him in that moment, the kind that cuts right through careful management and goes straight to the bone, and she looked back down at her notes because she needed to. We need to move quickly, she said. 2 weeks before Rowlands arrives. We have to get the cattle drive organized and on the road within a week, because we need the money from the sale to be in hand before the mortgage renegotiation. And at the same time, we need to get documentation to the federal marshal in Guthrie. I can ride to Guthrie, Harvey said. I know what to tell the marshal. If I leave the day after tomorrow, I can be there and back within the week. Calhoun may have eyes on you. Then I need to leave without being seen. He paused. I also know where Calhoun's office is, and I know when the bank is generally emptied of staff in the late evenings. But I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting anything illegal. Annie looked at him with her most direct look. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that there are men in Calhoun's operation who are not happy with their situation. Men who were hired under false pretenses similar to mine. One of them, a man named Ira Bellows, has spoken to me about his regrets. If Bellows can be persuaded to provide the marshal with direct testimony, that is more valuable than any document. Can he be persuaded? I believe so. But it would require me to have a direct conversation with him, and that conversation cannot happen anywhere that Calhoun's other people might see it. Organize it, Annie said. Here if needed. This is still my land and Calhoun's people do not come onto it without my permission. Harvey looked at her with something in his face that she thought very briefly might be admiration. All right, he said. And Harvey, she said, he looked at her. You mentioned the mortgage agreement. You said your arrangement with Calhoun was to report on vulnerabilities. Does Calhoun have any intention of calling in the mortgage before September before the renegotiation on the basis of some claim of default? Harvey was quiet for a moment. There was some discussion of manufacturing a grounds for early default. I do not know the specifics of how he intended to construct it. I need to know. I will find out what I can from Bellows. Annie closed her journal. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen with the lamp burning low between them and the night sounds of the ranch coming through the window. Then she said, There is one more thing I want to say before we go to sleep. Harvey waited. You told me the truth tonight when you could have kept it hidden, she said. I want you to know that I understand what that cost you. I understand it was a choice, and I understand what kind of choice it was. She paused. I am not forgiving everything all at once, but I want you to know that I am not dismissing it either. Harvey said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, Thank you. She blew out the lamp. The next 10 days were the most concentrated effort of Annie Dugan's life. The cattle drive was organized in 72 hours of intensive logistics, negotiating with the 2 neighboring ranchers whose herds she would consolidate with for the drive, securing supplies, confirming the northern buyer who had been in tentative correspondence with her for weeks, mapping the route to avoid the complications of the 3 creek crossings that were running high after the recent rains. Harvey organized the meeting with Ira Bellows on the second day, in the kitchen of the Dugan Ranch house at 4 in the morning, a time selected for its low likelihood of observation. Bellows was a compact, wiry man in his 40s with the look of someone who had been making poor decisions for years and had recently realized it. He sat across from Annie with his hat on the table and told her what he knew about the manufactured default, which was specific and detailed, and combined with Harvey's testimony and the written agreement Harvey provided, constituted the kind of evidentiary package that made federal prosecutors interested. Harvey left for Guthrie the morning of the 3rd day, before sunrise, leaving through the eastern pasture and looping south to pick up the road without being seen from Ridge Rock's Main Street. He left with the written agreement, Bellows's written statement, and a letter from Annie to the federal marshal that laid out the situation with the clarity and precision of someone who had been raised by a man who believed that clear, direct language was the most powerful tool available to a person. He was due back in 6 days. Annie ran the cattle drive preparation without him, which she was fully capable of doing, and which she did, though she was aware of his absence in a way that was not only professional. On the 5th day, Calhoun came to the ranch himself. He arrived in a good carriage with Tate riding alongside, and 2 other men she did not recognize. He was a heavy man in his 60s, well dressed in the way of men who use clothing to communicate authority. With a silver-handled cane he did not appear to need, and a quality of settled confidence that Annie recognized as the settled confidence of a man who had not been refused anything important in a very long time. She met him in the yard. She did not invite him inside. "Miss Dugan," Calhoun said, with the particular warmth of a man who is about to offer you something you did not ask for and do not want, "I hope you have had sufficient time to consider my offer." "I have considered it," Annie said. She stood with her hands easy at her sides and her hat shading her eyes, and she looked at Calhoun the way she looked at weather coming in, reading it, calculating it, planning her response. "My answer remains the same as before," Calhoun smiled. "I had hoped for a different response. I am afraid that a different response may have been in your best financial interest. I understand there are certain pressures regarding the mortgage." "You would know about those pressures better than most people," Annie said, with no particular emphasis on any word of it. Something shifted in Calhoun's expression. The warmth thinned slightly. "I run a bank, Miss Dugan." "The management of mortgages is a normal function of a bank. The manipulation of federal surveys is not," Annie said. The warmth was entirely gone now. Calhoun looked at her with the eyes of a man who has just realized that a situation he thought he controlled has developed a dimension he did not anticipate. He looked from her to the ranch house behind her to the hands working in the visible pasture, and then back to her. "I do not know what you think you know," he said, quietly now. "I know enough," Annie said, "and so does the federal marshal's office in Guthrie." The silence after she said it was significant. Calhoun's gaze moved to where Tate was sitting on his horse, and Tate's expression had gone careful. Then Calhoun looked back at Annie, and she saw in him the recalculation happening, the rapid assessment of what she might actually have and whether it was worth pushing further. "The Dugan property is not worth the trouble," Calhoun said finally, and there was something in it that sounded, for the first time, almost honest. "You should know that." "Then stop trying to take it," Annie said. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he said, "Good day, Miss Dugan," in the clipped tone of a man who has decided to retreat and is covering the retreat with formality, and he turned and went back to his carriage and was driven away with Tate and the other 2 men behind him. Annie stood in the yard and watched them go and took a slow breath in and a slow breath out, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after you have been frightened without allowing yourself to show it. Harvey came back 2 days later, on the 7th day from his departure, arriving in the afternoon with dust on his coat and a look on his face that Annie read immediately. "The marshal has opened an investigation," he said before she could ask. Rollins has already been pulled for questioning in connection with 2 other complaints about falsified surveys in the territory. Our information goes directly into that investigation. The marshal also said the written agreement implicating Calhoun in the scheme to defraud a land claimant is one of the cleaner pieces of evidence he has seen in this kind of case. "And you?" she said. He paused. The marshal was interested in my situation. He sees me as a cooperating witness. He indicated that cooperation would weigh heavily in any subsequent proceedings. Annie nodded. "Good. Annie," his voice shifted slightly. "Yes, Calhoun came while I was gone, didn't he? He came. And—" She looked at him. "I told him I knew enough. He left." Harvey studied her face. "You faced him alone." "I have been facing things alone for a long time," she said, and it came out differently than it had the last time she said it, not as a wall but as something closer to a statement of fact being offered up for reassessment. Harvey stepped toward her, and she did not step back, and he stood close to her in the yard of her father's land with the afternoon sun on his face and said, "You do not have to keep doing it alone. I know I said that before, and I know there was a lie underneath me when I said it. I am saying it again now without the lie underneath it." She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "I know." And then she closed the remaining distance between them and pressed her forehead against his chest, not kissing him, just standing, just being close, and felt his arms come around her carefully, as if she were something that might break, and she thought no, not break, but perhaps bend. And she let herself do that for a moment, let the straight line of her spine that she had kept rigidly vertical for 6 months curve slightly into him, and it was one of the most extraordinary moments of her life. "The cattle drive leaves day after tomorrow," she said into his shirt. She felt him laugh, very quietly, just a breath of it. "Yes, it does," he said. "The drive north to the Kansas border took 11 days. Annie rode it the way she had always intended to, from the front, setting the pace, making the decisions, with Harvey beside her and 3 other reliable hands managing the herd from the flanks and rear. They consolidated with a neighbor's 200 head at the first day's camp, bringing their total to 437 cattle, which was enough to make the drive economically meaningful. The drive was hard in the way all drives are hard, the sheer physical grind of it, the dust and the heat and the long days in the saddle, and the nights camped on open ground. There were 2 river crossings that required significant management, and one afternoon, where a rattlesnake spooked the horses, and a section of the herd scattered, and had to be patiently collected over the course of 2 hours. There were cookfires in the evenings and coffee in the mornings, and the particular quality of closeness that develops among people working a difficult thing together. And there was Harvey, steady at her side through all of it. They talked constantly during the long riding hours, the way people talk when they have the sustained time and the relative privacy of the trail, moving through things systematically, the way the drive itself moved through territory. They talked about the land and its future, about what Annie wanted to build on her father's claim, not just cattle but a proper working ranch with good infrastructure, maybe some farming on the eastern parcels where the soil was deep. They talked about his years on the Kisham Trail drives, the specific texture of those memories, the men he had known, the landscapes, the way the prairie looked at dawn when the light came in flat from the east and turned everything briefly gold. They talked about what had happened by the river, more than once and from different angles, with an increasing honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable and always clarifying. Harvey talked about the specific moment when the assignment had stopped being something he could execute, not as a defense but as a history, trying to trace exactly where the line had been crossed, and Annie listened with the full attention she gave important things. "I think it was the stone skipping," he said one evening, which surprised her so much she almost spilled her coffee. "What?" "The afternoon by the river the second week. You picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, and then looked at the opposite bank like you were calculating the distance. And then you turned around and said the western pasture needed a second water trough before summer and we needed to figure out how to build one. You went from stone skipping to infrastructure planning in about 4 seconds. Annie stared at him. That made you stop being able to complete your assignment. It made me realize you were a complete person, Harvey said simply. Not a problem to be managed. Not a land claim to be acquired. A person who skips stones and thinks about water troughs, and probably has about 40 other things going on at the same time. And then the assignment started to feel like what it actually was, which is a plan to take something from a real person who doesn't deserve to lose it. Annie was quiet for a moment. That is a very specific thing to remember. I remember all of it, he said, and the simplicity of it went straight past her defenses and into the warm part of her that she had been trying to keep protected. I remember you, she said quietly, which was possibly the most honest thing she had said to another person in years. They arrived at the railhead town near the Kansas border on the 12th day, and Annie sold 419 cattle, the rest having been sold off along the route to 2 smaller buyers at a price she was satisfied with, and received a sum of money that was, when she worked the arithmetic on the flat surface of the buyer's desk, sufficient to cover the mortgage renegotiation in full and leave her with a working capital reserve that changed the character of her situation from survival to something beginning to resemble stability. She sat with the bank draft in her hands and felt, for the first time since her father's death, like she could breathe all the way down. Harvey was waiting outside when she came out of the buyer's office, leaning against the post with his arms crossed and his hat shading his face, and he read her expression before she said a word. "Done," he said. "Done," she confirmed. He crossed the space between them and took her hand simply, clasping it between both of his, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face, and she thought about all the things that hand had represented over the past 6 weeks. The deception, the work, the truth, the choice to tell her the truth even when he did not have to, and she thought about what she wanted the future to look like. She thought she had a fairly clear idea. The ride back to Redrock took 4 days, and on the 3rd night of it, camped by a creek a day's ride from home, with the other hands asleep and the fire burning low, Harvey had said without preamble or visible preparation, "I want to stay." Annie looked at the fire. "At the ranch. In your life," he said. "At the ranch. In this territory, with you, all of it if you'll have me." She had been waiting for this conversation in the way you wait for whether you have seen building for days. Not with dread, but with the particular attention of someone who knows it is coming and wants to be ready for it. "I told you we were doing this in order," she said. "Land first." "The land is handled," he said, "or as handled as it can be until the federal investigation completes. The mortgage renegotiation is still in September. We have the money." She looked at him. "You have thought through all the objections." "I have been thinking through them for about 2 weeks," he said with the dry edge she had come to love. "Harvey," she said, "Annie, I need you to understand something." She turned to face him fully, the fire between them, the creek sounds and the night sounds around them. "What I felt for you started under false circumstances. I have had to work through the fact that the thing I felt was real even though the situation it started in was not fully honest. I have worked through it. I believe what you felt and feel is also real. I believe the choice you made by the river was not a small choice, and I do not treat it as one." She paused. "But I need you to know that I am not a woman who makes allowances indefinitely. I am not a woman who forgives and then forgets in a way that lets things slide. If you stay, it is with the full understanding that honesty is not optional, that what happened by the river is the last secret between us." "It is," Harvey said, and the steadiness of it, the complete absence of qualification or hedging, settled something in her that had been slightly wound since the day by the river. "Then yes," she said, "stay." They were quiet for a moment with the fire between them and the whole dark prairie around them and something settled and warm in the air. "Come around here," she said, and he moved around the fire to her side of it, and she leaned against him and felt his arm go around her, and the fire was warm and the night was clear, and she thought, with something like wonder, That this was what it felt like when something you did not know you were looking for showed up in the most complicated possible circumstances and turned out to be exactly what it was. She tipped her head and kissed him in the firelight properly this time, not the brief stunned thing in the storm, but something deliberate, something chosen, and he kissed her back with the same quality of deliberateness, his hand coming up to her jaw, and it was a long moment before either of them stopped. "The other hands are going to notice in the morning," she said against his mouth. "Let them notice," he said. She pulled back far enough to look at him. "You know, for a man who spent 2 weeks keeping a significant secret, you are remarkably unconcerned about discretion." "Different kind of secret," he said. "The kind I would rather not keep." She smiled at him, fully and without management, for probably the first time since she had known him, and felt him smile back. And it was one of those moments that will attach itself to a person's memory and stay there. The firelight, the creek, the smell of horses and grass and smoke, and this man whose face she had already, without quite deciding to, started to think of as home. They arrived back at the Dugan ranch the following afternoon. In the weeks that followed, the situation with Calhoun resolved with the thoroughness that Annie had worked to ensure. The federal marshal's investigation moved quickly once it gathered momentum, because the complaint about falsified surveys was not an isolated one. Rowlands had apparently been operating this scheme across multiple territory claims, and the documentation Harvey and Bellows had provided gave the investigation solid footing. Rowlands was formally charged in the second week of August, and the subsequent investigation swept into Calhoun's arrangements with enough force to require the closing of 2 of his business operations and the appointment of a federal oversight agent at the Red Rock Bank. Calhoun himself was not immediately arrested, the legal machinations of the territory being what they were, but he was effectively neutralized. His ability to manage the mortgage on the Dugan property had been transferred to the federal oversight agent, who renegotiated it at standard terms in September without drama or manipulation. Annie made the first payment on the new schedule on the first day of October and felt the satisfaction of it all the way down. Harvey's formal cooperation with the federal investigation went the way the marshal had suggested it might. His written testimony was accepted, his cooperation was noted, and the judge reviewing his specific role in the scheme concluded that his active provision of evidence against the scheme's principals, at personal legal and financial risk to himself, constituted a mitigating circumstance substantial enough to result in a suspended sentence and a period of formal community work in the territory. The latter of which he served primarily by helping the federal agent audit the land claims that Calhoun's operation had potentially affected. He came back to the ranch every evening. This arrangement, Harvey working the federal audit during the day and returning to the Dugan ranch in the evening, continued through the autumn, and in the evenings he worked alongside Annie on the ranch's next phase, the winter preparation, the fence repairs, the planning for the spring season, and the slow, real construction of something between them that was built on honesty and shared work, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of each other's imperfections. He asked her to marry him on a November evening by the river. It was not planned dramatically. They had ridden out to check the fence line on the western pasture, the same western pasture whose boundaries Rowlands had been commissioned to falsify, and the sun was going down in the particular spectacular way of Oklahoma Territory autumn sunsets, all orange and deep red, and they had dismounted and stood at the river's edge, and Harvey had taken her hand and said, simply and without preamble, because that was his way, "Marry me." Annie looked at the river for a moment. The Cimarron was lower now, calmer, the summer rains long past, running quiet and clearish over the red stones. She thought about the first time she had stood here with him, the fury and the devastation of hearing what he had to tell her. She thought about him standing with his hat in his hands and his eyes finding hers and not looking away. She thought about the choice he had made to tell her the truth, the specific courage of that choice, The fact that it had cost him and he had made it anyway. She thought about the man he had been in the months since, steady and honest and present in a way that went all the way down. Not the performed constancy of a man trying to prove something, but the actual constancy of a man whose character, when you had seen all of it including the parts that had failed, turned out to be genuinely worth trusting. She thought about how she felt when she heard his footstep in the morning, that specific footstep she could identify from across the yard now with perfect accuracy. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those dark eyes, with all the patience in the world, and she thought this is what it is to be known and to know, the thing she had been afraid of and the thing she wanted most. Yes, she said. He was very still for one moment, the way he went still when something hit him squarely and he was absorbing it, and then he put both hands on her face and kissed her with a thoroughness that left her briefly unable to think clearly about anything, which she considered a satisfactory response. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1889, at the small Methodist church in Red Rock, in a ceremony attended by the three ranch hands, Ira Bellows and his wife, the federal oversight agent who had come to appreciate both of them over the course of the autumn's work, and Mrs. Cora Finch, Annie's Aunt Cora, who had come out from Missouri on the train with the announced intention of assessing the situation and the unannounced intention, which was obvious to everyone, of deciding whether Harvey Atkins was good enough for her niece. Cora Finch was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who wore good clothes and had strong opinions about everything, and she spent the first day of her visit at the ranch asking Harvey questions with the pleasant neutrality of someone conducting an interrogation. Harvey answered her questions with complete directness, including the questions about his past and his original purpose in coming to Red Rock, which he told her without being asked, because Annie had mentioned that Cora already knew, and he felt it was important to say it himself rather than have it mentioned as a background fact. Cora had looked at him for a long, assessing moment after he told her. Then she had said, "You told her the truth when you didn't have to, and you told me the truth right now when I also wasn't going to catch you in a lie." "Yes, ma'am," Harvey said. "Why?" "Because her life and her choices deserve to be based on accurate information," Harvey said. "And so does yours if you're deciding what to think about me." Cora had looked at Annie, who was watching this exchange from across the kitchen table with her coffee cup in both hands, and then back at Harvey. "All right," Cora had said, which, as Annie later explained, was about as ringing an endorsement as Cora gave anyone. The wedding was simple and genuine, which was the best kind. Annie wore a dress of dark green wool that Cora had brought from Missouri, good quality and practical, which suited Annie perfectly. Harvey wore his best jacket and a clean shirt and had, Annie noticed with something soft in her, clearly spent considerable time on his hair. They said the vows in front of the minister and the assembled witnesses in the small, warm church with the winter light coming through the windows, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Harvey turned to look at her, Annie thought about the river and about truth, and about the specific, unrepeatable alchemy of two people who have found each other against long odds, and she felt, with a completeness she had not expected to feel again in her life, profoundly grateful. The reception was at the ranch house, which Cora had organized with the efficiency of a general and the taste of a woman who knew that a meal was a form of care. There was food enough for twice the company and a bottle of rye whiskey that someone had procured, and which was deployed with appropriate celebration. Ira Bellows turned out to be an unexpectedly good fiddle player and played for 2 hours while people danced in the cleared main room, and Annie danced with Harvey in the light of the oil lamps while the winter wind moved across the prairie outside, and the warmth inside was very complete. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone and Cora was in the guest room and the house was quiet, Annie and Harvey sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the dark land. "This is my father's land," Annie said quietly. "Our land," Harvey said. She felt the word settle in her like something taking root. "Our land," she said. The winter was full and good. Cora stayed through January, which was longer than she had announced, and this length of stay was itself a form of approval that Annie recognized and appreciated. The two women worked together in the way of women who are competent at the same things and respect each other for it, managing the house and the ranch's winter operations with a shared efficiency that Harvey navigated with the good sense to be helpful and unobtrusive. Harvey's formal period of community work for the federal court ended in February, and with it came the full transition to his role as a partner in the management of the Dugan Ranch, which Annie had already been treating as a fact, and which became formally true with the adding of his name to the operational paperwork. They spent the winter planning the spring. The cattle drive had given them the capital to invest in the next phase, and they were ambitious but careful about it, the combination of temperaments that tends to produce actual results. They planned an expansion of the herd, a second water trough in the western pasture, as Annie had been thinking about back in the summer when Harvey had first noticed who she was, a better fence line on the north boundary, and the construction of a proper barn to replace the aging structure her father had built quickly in the first year of the claim. In March, Annie told Harvey she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, and she watched his face go through something she could not quite categorize because it was too many things at once, and then he was across the kitchen and his arms were around her, and he did not say anything for a moment, just held her in that careful way he had, and she heard him take a slow breath that was full of feeling. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the right question. "I am very well," she said. "I am also somewhat terrified." "Me too," he said, which she had not expected and which meant more than a declaration of pure, uncomplicated joy would have. "We will figure it out," she said. "We will," he agreed. "We figure most things out." She pulled back to look at him, and his face was full of that unmanaged feeling she had come to love, the way he let the real thing show without dressing it up, and she thought about how wrong she had been to assume, back in those early weeks, that she understood who this man was. She had been suspicious of the gaps in his story, and those gaps had been real, but the character underneath the gaps had also been real, more real than a great many people whose biographies were entirely straightforward. Cora, informed by letter, sent back a reply that was 3 pages long and full of practical advice about pregnancy and childbirth, and some opinions about diet and rest that were strongly worded. She also mentioned that she was very happy and that Thomas would have been pleased, which was the thing Annie had needed to hear without knowing she needed to hear it, and she cried briefly and quietly over the letter, and then put it carefully in the small cedar box where she kept important papers. The spring brought work and growth. The barn construction began in April, a community effort that involved several of the neighboring ranchers, which was the way large construction jobs were done in the territory, people coming together to share the labor, and which had the secondary effect of embedding the Atkins Dugan Ranch more firmly in the social fabric of the community around Reed Rock. Harvey worked alongside everyone else with his characteristic efficiency, and Annie directed the project from the saddle until she was far enough along in the pregnancy that Harvey firmly and diplomatically suggested she might direct it from the porch instead, which she agreed to with only moderate argument. The spring cattle drive was smaller than the previous years, a measured expansion of the operation that prioritized quality of the herd over sheer numbers, and it went smoothly, managed largely by Harvey and the head hand, a capable man named Dahlin, while Annie remained at the ranch. She found the period of waiting harder than she had expected, not because she worried about the drive, but because she was not the sort of person who waited easily, and she occupied herself with the operational planning for the following season, and with reading the newspapers from Guthrie and writing letters and learning, slowly and with some resistance, to let things proceed without her direct management. Harvey came back from the drive on the 20th day to find the ranch immaculate, the accounts updated, the plans for the following year's expansion written out in neat detail, and his wife sitting on the porch with her considerably expanded middle and a look of calm competence that he said later was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen in his life. "You have been organizing," he said, coming up the porch steps and kissing her with the particular relief of a man who has been away and is back where he belongs. "I had time," she said. He sat beside her and took her hand and looked out at their land in the evening light, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had started doing in the autumn and which had, by spring, become one of her favorite positions in the world. "Good drive?" she asked. "Very good," he said. "We came home with more than we expected. I told you the Harrington buyer would come up if you held on the opening price." "You were exactly right," he said, without the slightest defensive qualification, which she had noticed was how he always responded when she was right, and which she had noted as one of his better qualities. The baby came in July, a boy, arriving in the world with considerable noise and energy in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, attended by the local midwife and by Cora, who had come back to the territory in June and shown no signs of leaving, which neither Annie nor Harvey mentioned because neither of them wanted her to leave. Harvey had spent the labor pacing the length of the porch, which the midwife had firmly directed him to, and when the baby's first cry had cut through the summer night air, he had stopped pacing and stood very still with his hands on the porch railing and his head down, and Annie heard later from Cora that he had been quietly unable to speak for several minutes. They named the boy Thomas James Atkins, Thomas for her father, James for Harvey's father, whom Harvey had spoken of with the particular careful tone that indicated a complicated love. Thomas James Atkins arrived in the world at 6 pounds and some ounces, with dark hair that managed to suggest both of his parents at once, and was received by the territory's Atkins Dugan ranch community with a celebration that involved, among other things, Ira Bellows's fiddle and another bottle of rye whiskey from a source that continued to be diplomatically unnamed. Annie lay in the bedroom with her son in her arms and her husband sitting on the edge of the bed looking at both of them with an expression she did not have a word for, something too large and too complete for a single word, and she thought about the river. She thought about standing at the edge of the Cimarron with red mud under her boots and betrayal burning in her chest, and she thought about how close she had come to sending him away. She thought about the flat stone she had thrown into the river, the way it had skipped 3 times before the current took it. She thought about everything that had been in motion in that moment, the forces visible and hidden, the things known and not yet known, and the way a truth told at the right moment, even at the worst moment, even at the most frightening moment, can change the entire course of what happens next. "Hello, Thomas," she said to the baby, who was awake and regarding her with the profound solemnity of the newly arrived. Harvey reached out and touched the baby's hand, one small finger curled around one large one, and he looked up at Annie with that dark warmth she had first seen across a mercantile counter on a summer day that already felt like a different lifetime. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For believing that the truth was worth something," he said, "that day by the river, for not sending me away." She looked at him, her husband, the father of her son, the man who had come to her under false pretenses and chosen truth at the cost of everything he had planned, and she thought about what she had learned about trust in the past year, how it was not built in the absence of failure, but in the honest navigation of it, how the people worth trusting were not the people who never fell down, but the people who got back up without pretending they had not fallen. "You made it easier," she said. "When you told me yourself, that was the thing," he nodded. He understood what she was saying, the specific weight of that choice by the river, the way it had cost him and the way it had, eventually, despite the pain of it, made space for everything that came after. Thomas had fallen asleep against Annie's chest with the easy confidence of someone who has arrived somewhere safe and knows it, and the July night was warm and the lamps were low, and the ranch sounds came through the open window, the horses, the crickets, the particular deep quiet of the territory at night, And it was one of those moments that exist outside time, that a person carries for the rest of their life as a reference point for what it is possible to feel. The years that followed built on what they had started. The ranch grew steadily, not recklessly, but with the careful ambition of two people who understood that sustainable growth was more valuable than spectacular growth. By 1892, they had expanded the herd significantly, added a proper smokehouse and a root cellar, built a second bunkhouse for additional hands, and established a small side operation growing feed crops on the eastern parcels that turned out to be more profitable than Annie had initially projected. Harvey became a known figure in the territory, respected for his work and for his willingness, which had become somewhat well known after the federal investigation, to have done the right thing in a situation where the wrong thing would have been easier. He was not a man who talked about it, but people knew the outline, and in a territory where integrity was tested daily and often found wanting, it counted. Annie became known for something harder to categorize, a quality of clear-eyed competence combined with a genuine openness that people found trustworthy in the particular way that someone is trustworthy when they have been tested and not broken. She was asked to serve on the committee organizing the territory's application for statehood in the early 90s, not as the woman who ran her father's old cattle claim, but as a person whose judgment was valued by the people around her. Thomas grew up in the way of children who are raised on working land, practically and quickly, learning to ride before most children his age elsewhere had learned anything comparable, interested in the horses in the way his father was interested in them, and in the management of the land in the way his mother was interested in it, which was a combination that the adults around him regarded with considerable satisfaction. A second child arrived in 1893, a daughter they named Cora Ruth, the first name for Aunt Cora, who had, by this point, more or less permanently relocated to the territory and seemed entirely content with the arrangement, and the middle name for Harvey's mother, Ruth, who had died when he was young and who he had talked about only once, carefully and with evident feeling, on a winter night by the kitchen fire. Cora Ruth arrived with red hair that was Annie's red and Harvey's dark mixed into something entirely her own, and a temperament that combined Harvey's stillness with Annie's drive in a configuration that Aunt Cora described, with genuine admiration, as potentially dangerous. The Calhoun situation resolved completely in 1893, when Gerald Calhoun, facing the full weight of the federal investigation and a separate civil case brought by multiple land claimants, agreed to a settlement that included the transfer of the Red Rock Bank to a federally chartered institution and the dropping of any remaining claim or connection to the land deals that had been part of his operation. He left the territory the following year, and no one in Red Rock arranged any particular farewell. Ira Bellows, whose testimony had been instrumental in the whole proceeding, received a formal commendation from the federal marshal's office and used the small sum of money that came with the resolution of his own legal situation to open a farrier operation in Red Rock that became modestly successful. He and his wife were regular dinner guests at the Atkins ranch through the rest of the decade. By the middle of the 1890s, the Atkins Ranch, which was formally registered as the Dugan-Atkins Land and Cattle Operation, was one of the better regarded operations in the county. Not the largest and not the richest, but reliably well-run and ethically operated in a territory where that distinction still meant something, because the territory was young enough that its norms were still being established, and the choices of the people in it were helping establish them. Annie stood at the river on a spring evening in 1895, watching the Cimarron run clear and steady over its red stone bed, not swollen with rain now, but moving at its own pace in the early season light. 6 years since she had stood here with her boots in the red mud and heard a man say those words. 6 years since the world she had thought was stable had dropped away, and she had stood in the resulting space and made a choice about what to do next. Thomas was 5 now, and was at this moment somewhere behind her on the bank looking for flat stones to throw, which was something she had taught him, and which had become one of their established activities at the river. Harvey was 20 yards downstream, examining the bank for the erosion that heavy spring rains could cause, walking the edge of the water with his eyes down, thorough as always, missing nothing. He looked up and caught her looking at him, and across the 20 yards of evening air between them something passed, the specific communication of two people who have spent years learning each other's language, the complete and shorthand understanding of the long intimate, and he smiled, the full version of the smile she had learned to wait for because it was not given casually. Thomas found a flat stone and held it up. "Mama, look at this one." "Perfect," Annie said, coming to him. "Now remember, low angle, wrist at the end." Thomas threw the stone with great seriousness and genuine technique, and it skipped once, twice, 4 times before the river took it. 4. Thomas announced with considerable satisfaction. "Your best yet," Annie confirmed. Harvey had come up the bank to join them, putting his arm around Annie from behind, his chin resting on top of her head as she watched their son look for another stone. She felt the weight of him behind her and the warmth of it and the completeness of it, this man and this child and this land and this river and this evening light. She thought about truth, about what it costs to tell it and what it costs not to. About a man standing by a river with his hat in his hands saying, "I was not supposed to tell you this yet," and then telling her anyway because some things are too large to carry alone, and some people are too important to lie to, and some moments are the ones you will look back on for the rest of your life as the one where everything changed. "What are you thinking?" Harvey asked quietly above her head. "About the river," she said. "About the first time we stood here." She felt him exhale, a long, slow breath. "Long time ago," he said. "Not so long," she said. "Long enough that I don't know how I managed before it," he said. Thomas found another stone and threw it with great concentration, and it went 6 times across the water, and he turned to them with a look of pure triumph that was so entirely his own, so specifically the face of this specific small person who was theirs, that Annie felt something so large she could not have named it properly if she had tried. "Did you see?" Thomas demanded. "We saw," Harvey said. "Every skip of it." The sun was going down behind the western pasture, the sky going to all that Oklahoma color, amber and deep rose and a thin line of gold right at the horizon, and the Cimarron ran quiet between its banks, the same river it had been 6 years ago when the truth had been told by its edge, and everything had turned on that moment, still running now, still moving toward wherever rivers go, carrying the light on its surface for one long moment before the evening took it. Annie leaned back into Harvey and watched their son at the river's edge and felt the full weight of her life, the grief that was in it and the work that was in it and the love that was in it, all of it together, and none of it something she would trade, not even the part that had hurt most, because that part was where the truth had been told and the truth had made space for everything that followed. "Come on, Thomas," she said. "Time to head back." Thomas made one more throw, 6 more skips, and then turned to take his father's hand, and the 3 of them walked back from the river toward home. The land was theirs. The land that her father had ridden hard to claim, that Calhoun had tried to take by subterfuge and by pressure, and by the manipulation of a man who had ultimately chosen truth over assignment. The land with its western pasture and its river access and its second water trough, and its new barn and its fields of feed crop along the eastern parcels and its 2 bunkhouses full of good hands and its house where Cora Ruth slept in her cradle right now under Aunt Cora's watchful eye. Their land. Harvey's hand was in hers, and Thomas was swinging their joined hands between his own small ones, and the evening birds were beginning, and the first stars were coming out in the east. And Annie Dugan Atkins walked home across her father's land with the man who had stood by a river in the last light of a summer afternoon and told her the truth, and thought that the territory was exactly as raw and difficult and full of possibility as it had always been described, and that she would not have it any other way. She was home, they were home, and the Cimarron ran on behind them, carrying the day into its current, moving always, always moving, toward the horizon where everything difficult and everything worth having was waiting together in the same impossible, necessary, golden light.